Hey everyone, back again here at Northern Spy Golf Club on a rainy Thursday for Derick's Daily Dose. We're going to go today into kind of situational pieces on the golf course, uneven lies, scenarios you may encounter out there that'll effectively change what happens to a golf shot, and we'll really work into some things you can do to combat those. So there's two reasons why golf shots change when you get into these situations, whether they're a side hill lie, the ball's above your feet or below your feet, or downhill lie and your body's kind of going downhill, and then an uphill lie where your body's going uphill, or you get into a divot, or you get into all these other things. One is the technology piece to it, how the club face arrives at impact, and how does that affect the interaction with the ball. The other piece is really what that is doing to your body and how that's changing how your body moves. So if we have a better understanding level of those two things, we'll start to understand why we get certain results when we get into these scenarios. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the golf club. I've got a 7-iron, and really what we're going to do is we're going to show you that when the club's presented square, your average 7-iron has, mine has 33 degrees of loft. Typical sets now are somewhere in the low 30s, maybe around 30. And then your lie angle, your average lie angle, again, mine's 62 or 61 and a half. It's 1 degree flat. So I think your average 7-iron lie angle is around 62 and a half degrees. So what's going to happen when that club's presented square is that club has 33 degrees of loft, okay? So when that ball is impacted, it's going to create an initial launch angle and an effectively enough amount of spin, let's call it around the 6,500 RPMs, 6,000 RPMs, to get that ball to travel in a window that's 18, 19 degrees of launch with about, like I said, 6,500 RPMs of spin. That'll maximize our distance and get the ball to react properly when it gets on the green. As the club gets more loft, it's higher launching and more spinning, so it goes shorter, and vice versa. As you get to the longer clubs, it launches a little bit lower and spins a little less to go further. You couple that with the length change in the golf club, and that's why you have discernible differences between your clubs. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to take that club and I am going to turn it on its side. So now the heel's on the ground. So this club still has 33 degrees of loft, but because I've changed the plane and structurally I've changed where it's presented, that loft is now essentially shutting the golf club 33 degrees. If I change it the other way, what we'll notice is, again, that loft is not up in the air anymore. That loft is now to the right, 33 degrees, okay? So never in a scenario are we severe enough where we're gonna, impact the ball, where that shaft is completely parallel to ground, and never are we gonna impact it, where that shaft is the opposite way, completely parallel to the ground. So really what we have to understand here, though, is that when the ball for a right-handed golfer is above my feet, essentially what I'm doing is I'm changing that loft so that it's not as much pointed in the air. It is now a little bit pointed to the left. So if that club arrives perfectly square in this scenario, it's going to be slightly more offset because the loft change is now pointed to the left instead of pointed up. So that is why for a lot of times for right-handed golfers, when that ball's above your feet and you hit it, that ball curves to the left. So it's going to hook because essentially you've got a club that's more offset. And the higher lofted the club, essentially the more offset the club becomes. So you may actually hook it more the more loft it has on it. And vice versa. If I'm in a situation where the ball's below my feet, what we're going to see here is that club's going to be presented, upright like this, which essentially, as we turn it, that loft is going to open face and it's going to make that ball tail to the right. So general rule of thumb, when you get those hook lies of balls above your feet, it's going to go to the left. Balls below your feet, it's going to go to the right. The secondary piece to this is how your body reacts, right? So we have to understand that when the ball is above our feet, what's going to tend to happen is most of your weight's going to get back to your heels, because that hill will kind of push you backwards. When you get with the ball below your feet, most of that weight's going to get to your toes. And we have to understand how that affects our ability to execute a golf swing. So we talked a lot in some previous lessons about what we want to do. We want to get in a good posture. We want to restrict with the lower half, and we want to rotate, and we want to turn. When we turn, that weight's coming to the inside, and then what we want to do is we want to get the hips and our lower body to turn to our target so that the upper body can follow back through. We have to move to execute really good golf swings, I think, and fundamentally, if we're going to control variables and do some things, I think, there's an efficiency in how we move. The slopes tend to prohibit or create movements that we necessarily don't want. So, when we get that ball above our feet, we have no problem turning. We have no problem turning in either direction. What we tend to have a hard time doing is we have a hard time not falling backwards and standing up and coming out of our posture. It's very hard to keep our chest down in this scenario. And when that happens and you fall out of it, the club tends to get out in front. We tend to, I would say, hit a lot of shots on the toe. And again, a lot of pulls, a lot of hooks because of how the club's presented and how our body moves. In this scenario, I'm going to definitely aim out to the right. I'm going to try and put that ball back in my stance, which will, again, shove that ball out to the right a little bit, so it counteracts a couple of those things. When that ball's below our feet, we're going to be on our toes. And when we're on our toes, what tends to happen is it saps our ability to turn, and move in both directions. It becomes a very armsy swing. In these scenarios, I definitely don't want to go at the ball. This is a shot that you can very easily shank because, when you start going at the golf ball, you're losing all that space to get the club head through. So in these golf shots, I try and get a little bit lower, almost with the bunker shots, more leg flex. I really kind of try and get my weight back into the hill. And I realize that my arms and hands are really going to be generating more of this motion. I know if my lower body gets involved, it's going to tend to move in the wrong direction. Again, in these shots, I counteract the ball going right just by trying to get my arms and hands a little bit more involved and shutting my body down. Downhill lies, again, what we're going to do here is we're going to, if you change the angle, right, and we're shifting down like this, what's going to happen is you're de-lofting the golf club. So even though you've got a golf club with 33 degrees of loft on it, effectively, when you get into that setup where you're downhill, and you want to definitely make sure that you get your shoulders on up and downhill lies to align with that, what's going to happen in that scenario is you're effectively going to change your 7-iron into probably a 5 or a 6-iron. So anytime I have downhill lies, I want to make sure that I've got my shoulders and they're going with the slope. I'm not trying to get my shoulders square to level earth, but I'm really getting my shoulders square to the slope I'm swinging on. I want to make sure I put it back in my stance, and the reason I put it back in my stance is the club comes from a vertical position and it comes down, okay? When we're on a hill, reminder that hill, there's turf there, right? So I can't get underneath it and behind it. You're gonna hit that fat. So you really have to make sure you let your shoulders ride the slope, get it back in your stance, and I would loft up. So, if I'm at a 7-iron distance, I think in these scenarios you can probably almost hit 8 or a 9-iron because, again, effectively what you're doing is you're changing the loft of the golf club, you're de-lofting it. With that ball back in your stance, you're going to launch it a little bit lower. It's really all, in any of these golf shots, it's all about ball contact. You want to get the ball on the face You want to hit it as crisply as possible, and you want to understand kind of what's happening in these golf shots because of how the club's arriving. Ball's up in the stance. Theoretically here, you're going to get your shoulders to ride the slope. You can put that ball up in your stance. What you're going to notice is that you're adding loft to the club now. So this ball is not going to go as far. It's going to go much higher. Again, so if I'm hitting a 7-iron, this is a scenario I probably hit 5 or 6 iron because the ball is going to go higher. It's not going to go as far. The one situational piece here is that, we talk about what the body does. When you get downhill like this, your body's going to have a tendency to slide down the hill. So it's easy to get, too far out in front. So just be cognizant of that and make sure that you're not sliding down the hill. And then again, when you get into this scenario where you're uphill like this, it's going to be really hard for you to transition to the front and transition forward and through the golf ball. So you're going to have to work really hard on making sure that, and sometimes on these shots, I'll play them a little bit further back in my stance because I know that I'm going to bounce backwards. And that helps me bottom the club out correctly. The only way you can get better at these uneven lie shots is to practice them. So I would just largely recommend trying to take some of the techniques, trying to take some of the understanding level of what happens, typically why the ball will curve one way or the other or go higher or go lower. Really work on how your body moves in those situations. So some people, their tendencies are exaggerated in these scenarios. So if you have a tendency to get to your toes and that ball's below your feet, you're gonna have a really hard time. So you're gonna have to battle a little bit harder than someone that, maybe stays on their heels in those golf shots. They don't bother them as much. Vice versa, if you get to your toes in the opposite lie, you may have a little bit easier time than someone who, who's the opposite. So moving on, transitioning to divots. It's a shot like, you hit the ball down the middle in the fairway and you should be rewarded with a good lie. But that's golf and it doesn't happen all the time. So a lot of times when you get in a divot, what you're gonna notice is that there's not as much, there's no grass there, right? So it's harder for you to get the golf club underneath the golf ball. And in that scenario, it's hard for you to get the ball on the right part of the face. So it's very easy in these shots to hit it on the bottom of the club, to hit it thin, which effectively changes how much you spin the golf ball, the launch angle, initial launch angle, and really your overall distance. So in these scenarios, what I like to do is I like to play it a little bit back in my stance, and I like to get a little bit lower. Again, what we're doing, just like in those bunker shots, is we're going to create a lower bottoming out point. We're going to get it back in our stance so that we make sure that we're hitting ball first. If you do this scenario from up front, you're just going to hit it fat. Okay, so we need to make sure that ball's back. We get a little bit lower. You're going to notice that that shaft ends up leaning forward, and we're really, going to try and hit down on that golf ball, get that club into the turf, get it up on the right part of the face, make sure that we can spin the ball and launch the ball properly. In this scenario, it typically comes out a little bit lower, and because of the increased interaction with the ground, you're going to notice some slowing down in the face. Again, this is a scenario where I'd probably hit an extra club. So if you hit a 7-iron, you may want to hit a 6-iron. Transitioning on, we'll talk about lies where they're, a really thick rough. And what we have to understand here, again, is what's happening to the golf club. So the longer the golf club we're trying to hit, the shallower the angle of attack, the closer that club stays to the ground, right? So, if I'm hitting a fairway wood and I'm further away from it, that swing's going to be flatter. And when that swing's flatter, what we'll notice is the proximity to the ground is much closer, right? So we take that circle and we're, flattening it out, tilting on its side. So it doesn't have as much depth to it. It stays closer to the ground. And what happens when you get in thick rough conditions is it makes the head more apt to interact with that grass. And when that happens, you'll get grass stuck in between the face and the ball. You'll get grass that'll wrap around the hosel of the golf club, and both of those scenarios produce bad golf shots. So people that have, flatter, shallower golf swings tend to have a really hard time hitting it out of thick rough. And a lot of that is just because, when you come in from a flatter, shallower angle of attack, you're gonna have a hard time. So on these golf shots, this is a shot. We talked a lot about trying to get the hands out of it to control face a little bit more. I think getting your hands more involved in this golf shot, what it'll do is it'll allow you to hinge the golf club up and down a little bit more vertically. And that's really necessary in these golf shots. So I want to get very vertical, very up and down in my golf shot. We're going to get a little bit handsy here, and really what that allows me to do is get the club to attack on a very steep angle where it has very limited interaction with the grass conditions. That club will get right down in there and get to the ball. So it's a tough golf shot. No way, shape, or form is it easy, but you're gonna have a lot more success if you steepen out your golf swing, you get a little bit more handsy, and you swing nice and hard, because that grass, when it starts to interact with the golf club, it's gonna slow down the head, it's gonna start to twist the face, and you're gonna hit golf shots either not well or all over the map. Another piece we talk about is like hard pan. So hard pan, or really, dirt, or cart path, you have to hit it off a cart path. These would be very similar, I would say, to your divot shots, where you want to make sure that, we're not going to be able to take a divot or get underneath the golf ball. So maybe a little bit less leg flex, but definitely get the ball back in your stance. And the reason being is we have to get that leading edge under the golf ball. So if we get that club, leaning back like this, and we don't get our hands out in front and control that leading edge, we're gonna have no shot at getting that leading edge underneath and getting face on the ball. So, if we get in a scenario like where you flip, see how the hands flip there, that head flips out in front, you're never, ever, ever gonna have success over these really hard pan type lies. One of the last ones, what I want to talk about was, on the collar, you get on the collar between the fringe and the rough, and that ball's up against it. I see a lot of people, you can't take your wedge and try and hit it like you normally do, because what happens is you're going to interact with that rough, it's going to slow down, and then all of a sudden you get to the ball and there's not that continuous slowdown. Now the club gets through it and it goes. So being able to judge how, fast you're going through those or how slow you're going through those becomes very difficult. What I prefer is take a fairway wood or a hybrid, or even a 7-iron or wedge, and really utilize that leading edge. Get to the upper hemisphere of the golf ball, so you're not going to let that club bottom out. You're going to really elevate it. Try and make a putting stroke where you're trying to hit the upper hemisphere of the golf ball and stay above that rough. You'll take it out of play. You'll get that ball running and rolling a little bit quicker, and you can go from there. So I think that's all I had for today in regards to kind of abnormal conditions. We worked on some side hill lies, downhill, uphill, heavy rough, divots, and then those collar, and then those kind of weird lies. So I hope everybody was able to gather some stuff today. Like everything, I think it's important to practice these shots, to execute these golf shots so that you feel comfortable with them. You can't turn around and have all the answers but not have any idea how to do it. So you have to try, you have to experiment, you have to execute these things. Based on what you do as an individual, you may find a scenario where your results are typically abnormal compared to what average people do. So really need trial and error to figure out kind of how your body reacts in those scenarios, what you feel comfortable with, what you don't, what you have to work on. And the more you can do that, the better first you're going to be when you get out on the golf course and you have to face those things. So thanks for tuning in today. We'll see everyone tomorrow for course management, and have a great day.